speaker of the afternoon. Noah Smith is Scouloudi Fellow at the Institute for Historical Research and is currently in the final year of his PhD at the University of Kent. His PhD thesis, Images of Conflict, the Formation of Cultural Memory, Civic Identity in the Wake of the Franco-Flemish War, 1297 to 1305, examines questions of community, civic participation, commemoration, and collective identity in 14th century Flemish art. Of particular interest to us this afternoon will be the reassessment of the well-known Courtrai Chest on display in the UK, or at least it will be when museums reopen. He has work forthcoming in several publications, including an essay in the University of Bern's Martial Culture in Medieval Town project relating to the Lugamiete Chapel. So it gives me great pleasure now to hand over to Noah Smith, whose paper is entitled The Cortride Chest at New College, Oxford, Iconography and Materiality. Over to you, Noah.
Thank you so much, Nick. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Before I start, I'd just like to thank both Nick and Chris for their mentorship for the past 2-3 years. I've learned so much in such a short span of time, and my work is just rendered so much more by how generous they both have been, both with their expertise and patience. So just a major thanks to both of them. So I would like to begin by thanking the RFS for organizing this terrific conference that's been over a year in the offing. It truly is an honor to be presenting my findings alongside such a group of rigorous and I think methodologically diverse scholars. All the papers today have really run the gamut of expertise, and that's something I've quite enjoyed. For some context, as Nick just mentioned, I'm currently in the final year of my PhD at the University of Kent, where my interdisciplinary thesis tackles issues of commemoration, memory, civic participation, and the articulation of certain iconographical motifs among the guilds in 14th century Flanders. On that note, I'd also like to thank the IHR, the RHS, and the Paul Mellon Center for supporting much of the archival and fieldwork that has made my research possible. Today, I'll be walking you through one of the core case studies of my thesis, a reassessment of the Courtrai Chest, or Oxford Chest, as it has been known in Belgium. I will begin by reviewing the circumstances of its quote-unquote discovery and its ensuing controversies. Many of these will be addressed and hopefully resolved by reviewing the chest's materiality. Finally, I will unpack the visual program of its carved frontispiece and end with some informed speculation as to how and when it came to reside in England. So, there we go. Discovered in 1905 by Warden Archibald Spooner of New College, Oxford, in a dilapidated barn of one of the university's tenants in Stanton St John, the Cortride Chest is a beautiful example of early 14th century wood carving and 17th century reconstruction. The frontispiece, carved in low relief, measures 100 centimeters by 71 centimeters across and has been dated as having been carved relatively soon after the events of the Battle of the Golden Spurs, which is the central focus of its visual narrative. Corresponding joints and structural similarities between the frontispiece and backpiece suggest that the backpiece is also original, though only the beautiful carvings of the front have warranted in-depth dating attempts. We'll get more to the dating soon. I know everyone's really keen to hear that. The rest of the chest is thought to be of early 17th century construction. Due to its relatively recent resurfacing at the hands of Spooner, the chest has attracted its fair share of controversy in the recent years. Even the circumstances surrounding its discovery are vague. William Hayter, Spooner's biographer and close friend, wrote in his official biography of the dean that, and I quote, "The progress notes do not refer to the most important event of his visit. In one of the ruinous barns the warden observed an oak chest, in use as a corn bin, the front of which was elaborately carved. He bought it from William Harris, the farmer, for £50, or at least wrote off £50 worth of Harris's rent arrears to the college." End quote. Hayter is correct in so much as the progress notes make no mention of anything concerning the chest. Furthermore, there's no evidence that Spooner paid the Harrises for it or remitted any amount of money on behalf of the college. And I think this is quite important. On June 17th, 1903, the Harrises' rent was reduced from £42 to £30 a year, and the new college committee agreed to, and I quote, remit his arrears of rent in excess of £30, end quote. Despite the reduction in rent, the Harrises kept accruing a debt that was substantial enough for New College to consider filing suit in 1904, though these proceedings happened at least a year before Spooner made his progress. It must also be observed that Spooner was made warden in 1903, and as such had already made several progresses through Stanton St John. The New College minutes of 1905 to 1909 make no mention of remitting £50 or paying such an amount out, even though they are clearly interested in the property in so much as the payments due by its tenants. It remained in Spooner's study for several years until reaching a wider audience by way of inclusion in Aymer Vallance's 1912 early furniture periodical in the Burlington Magazine. In it, he commended the depictions of, and I quote, deadly warfare in earnest, and the vigorous carving, while suggesting that on purely stylistic grounds, and there's going to be a lot of purely stylistic grounds for the next 40 minutes, it must be dated to the 14th century, and it was, and I quote, characteristically not English. Good intuition there. This was alongside a published plate of the frontispiece, which I'd show for you here. In a letter to the editor of that same year, Charles Ffoulkes, who was at the time the curator of the Royal Armouries in London, concretely identified the frontispiece as depicting the Battle of the Golden Spurs, using some lines from the chronicler Guillaume Gouillard. It is also at this stage that the goedendag was first identified, the iconic Flemish weapon having been the subject of fierce military and art historical debate in Belgium since the 19th century. I'll point it out as we come to it further on, but it's essentially, if you look in the iconography here, the massive club with the spike on the end. Keep that in mind. The chest would remain somewhat unknown out of more specialized circles, including commentary by academic heavyweights such as Charles Aumont and Henri Pirenne for nearly 4 decades, before the waves of its discovery carried awareness of the chest back to Belgium. And boy, did it make quite the splash. 1952 marked the 650-year anniversary of the Battle of the Golden Spurs, and it was in this year that Jans Frans Verbruggen, one of the most famous Belgian scholars of his generation, published the only monograph to include the chest, which was itself a small part of a much larger study on the battle itself. The authenticity of the chest was the focus of a series of back-and-forth letters to the editor in the Bijkorf journal. Jonker Bergeveld, using a methodology which consisted of showing published plates of the frontispiece to art dealers in Bruges, good luck getting away with that these days, levied charges of 19th century fakery. Verbruggen, alongside the archivist and historian Joost de Smet, countered that the Bruges antiquarians they had consulted, with noted aid of a magnifying glass, were of the opinion that the chest appeared to be at least 200 years old. All of this is to say, I think modern dendrochronologists everywhere deserve much more public thanks than we ostensibly give them. Despite this very public debate, the authenticity of the chest remained relatively unquestioned in England. This changed when in 1977, New College entered into talks to sell the chest and so had to become much more active in cementing its legitimacy. The less doubt there was surrounding the chest's authenticity, the more it could be sold for at auction, as these things go. Part of this process entailed getting the chest appraised by Sotheby's for 12 million francs, then displaying it in Courtrai, during which time it was dispatched to the Royal Institute of National Art Heritage in Brussels for several weeks in 1978. During this time, Roger-Henri Morniesson questioned the chest's authenticity due to its, and I quote, crude carvings, as well as stylistic similarities between other things, among other things, the Bayeux tapestry and the Lugemy chapel, which also feature in my thesis, coincidentally. However, a dendrochronological study conducted by John Fletcher at the University of Oxford's Research Laboratory for Archaeology and the History of Art proved fruitful, confirming that the upper plank of the frontispiece was felled sometime between 970 and 1243, the lower plank between 983 and 1216. This dating has been further refined since, with Ian Tyre suggesting the wood came from Scandinavia and supporting Fletcher's range of dates, and Martin Bridge and Daniel Miles referring to radiocarbon dating done circa 1985 to stretch the range from the outer rings of the planks from 1280 to as late as 1420. And I think Martin Bridge is here, so I hope what I'm saying is correct. Please let me know in the comments if it isn't. And what I include here are two very useful, I think, kind of a graph from E.T. Hall's re-examination of the chest. I think more so than any object I've ever come across, the chest has been reassessed, re-examined, recontextualized. It's just endlessly fascinating. This brings us to the material properties of the chest, and I think a necessary clarification. We all too often refer to the Courtride Chest or the Oxford chest as a composite whole. And I think this is a recurring theme that has cropped up throughout the conference today, usefully. This is dangerous, as the physical object is itself an amalgamation of several previous iterations of construction and use. The frontispiece, being the only section of the chest to have been concretely dated, is ostensibly the earliest component, dating to the early 14th century. The interior of the chest bears a series of grooves and support structures that suggest the back is contemporaneous with the front. The wood grain and wear of the sides and lid suggest a much later dating similar to that of the metal lock, which is itself an obvious replacement that was fixed in a much larger reserve. We'll get to the lock reserve in a moment. Also, I apologize for the state of these photographs, but the second time I went to photograph the chest, they had it up against the wall in the Muniment Tower at New College, and it's really hard to photograph the inside of a chest from the back without being able to climb into it, because they really don't like it when you do that. So, where was I? The interior of the chest bears a series of grooves and support structures that suggest the back is contemporaneous with the front. The original chest, circa 1302, would have undoubtedly have been of a two-borden panel construction, as demonstrated by this lovely rendering by Philippe de Potter and Didier Dumoulin. The duo led a 2006 reconstruction of the chest in Courtrai, which sought to create a facsimile of the chest as it might have originally looked. And I must thank Mr. Dumoulin for walking me through their facsimile back in 2018. However, returning to the original, there are a series of metal fixtures on the interior of the frontispiece, cross straps of iron that would have allowed the front to be folded outward. It has since been nailed firmly into its current state, but this could suggest that the frontispiece was part of a writing desk or some such mechanical piece of furniture at some point in time. The presence of the interior structures were theorized by A. van der Waal and R. Hugebart to be part of an elaborate false bottom, accessed by a hidden trigger mechanism on the front situated amongst the iconography. The presence of this compartment was, they argued, circa 2002, the evidence of the chest being a diplomatic gift to Sir John of Stanton St John, who allegedly had the ear of Edward I. While documentary evidence does not necessarily corroborate this, of the two often conflated Johns of Stanton St John, neither were active around Stanton until well after the Flemish rebellion had been put down circa 1305, nor are there any records of a Flemish diplomatic mission to England at this time, nor are there any material precedents for such a mechanically elaborate hidden compartment at this time. One does not need so many extra steps to facilitate a simple false bottom. And most hidden compartments, as Chris mentioned, in 14th century chests and earlier, are hidden just below the tills adjacent to the styles. That is to say, we have a vague idea of what secret compartments look like in chests at this time, and this is not it. It is important to consider just how the frontispiece found its way to England, and who may have brought it with them. I am of the opinion that the remnants of the interior structure on the front and back panels were put in place for purely structural considerations, greatly increasing the integrity of the chest in one iteration or another. And I should add, I know we have many kind of furniture makers attending today, and I would be more than happy to hear whatever you guys have to say, if you've seen anything similar to this, any interior structures, because comparisons have eluded me thus far. Furthermore, just because the remnants of this structure predate its final form, or at least the one it was discovered in circa 1905, does not preclude additional work done to the chest in the 700 years before its creation and resurfacing. Which leads me to this. As unique as the carved relief of the frontispiece may be, the Cortride chest is not without similarities to other 14th century chests. Furthermore, many of the chests that most closely share typological similarities with it have a penchant for turning up in southeastern England, and are ostensibly of quote-unquote Flemish origin. Many scholars who have written assessments of the Courtrai chest have rightfully been drawn to the aesthetic comparisons between its carved frontispiece and those of a type known as tilting chests or coffers. One of these that I've had the opportunity to study in person alongside Chris is the Hardy chest, currently residing in a parish church on the Isle of Sheppey. The chest itself is relatively unstudied, outside of its inclusion in several 20th century historical furniture catalogues, with only a topical material and iconographical assessment undertaken by Scott Robertson in 1876, upon which all other publications have lent. Van de Waal and Hugebart mention the chest in passing, and only as part of a larger corpus of tilting coffers, which they compare to the Courtrai chest. The 2006 reconstruction efforts likewise include it. All of these endeavors refer exclusively to mostly black and white prints of the chest, and it is here that I must stress how fortunate I've been to be able to study it in person. There is, unfortunately, no substitute for examining the real thing in situ, a fact that I'm sure many here can attest to. The Hardy chest measures 133 centimeters by 76 centimeters, including its blocks, and is 68 centimeters deep. The lid is a later replacement made of pine, and its hinges are of similarly modern origin. On the underside of the lid is an ink inscription reading Mary Hall, May 16, 1864, which suggests a tentative terminus postquem for its later editions. The body of the chest is made of straight, close-grained Baltic oak, similar to the Courtrai chest. It is also, in the same manner of the Courtrai chest, it is also sawn in the same manner of the Courtrai chest, with the presence of medullary rays indicating either a cleft or quarter sawn cut. Scott Robertson suggested that an earlier dating of the mid-14th century is warranted due to the iconographical similarities between one of the saddles depicted on the carved frontispiece and an illumination in the St. Albans Chronicle. I would push this back a bit to the late 14th or early 15th century based on the dating of similar tilting chests and the figural carvings present on the styles, as well as the refined microarchitecture. All of this is to say that the Hardy chest is a highly decorated, imported chest that dates to within a century of the Courtrai chest and bears many material and iconographical similarities. I will not go over the visual program of the Hardy chest at length, that lies within the remit of another paper altogether, but suffice it to say that it is typical of the tilting chest genre. Two armored knights ride towards each other mid-joust, their squires featured both in the background and in larger figural carvings on either side. The first and most striking similarity between the two chests is one of style. The depiction of the mounted jousters matches the way mounted figures are depicted across the Courtrai chest. Most notably, the charging French knight in scene 6, which I'll point out more clearly later, has his horse configured in the same manner as the rightmost knight on the Hardy chest. The front two legs are splayed outward and the hind legs are bent, pushing the horse's body relatively close to the ground. The depiction of the helmets on both chests are also similar, two straight lines ending in a vaguely conical bulge. The knight on the left, meanwhile, is holding his shield in the exact manner as Guy and William in this kind of mounted entourage on the chest. I hope you can see my cursor. Returning to the horses, the mounted squire in the background behind the right knight has his horse hunched forward, mane and ears tucked inside its bridle. Though considerably more detailed, as the Hardy chest generally is given the magnitude of the increase in scale, the forward slope of the equine's neck in conjunction with its bridle is very reminiscent of the curving heads and necks of the horses on the Courtrai chest. The general composition of the chest is also reminiscent of the Courtrai chest. The framing of the central board between two decorated styles, as the original Courtrai chest frontispiece would have almost undoubtedly been, and the lock given prominent space within the iconographical landscape of the carving. The lock is very not subtle. The most significant stylistic divergence is the forced perspective present in the upper left-hand corner of the hardy chest right over here. The tiled roof and frame are slanted, at odds with the more typical microarchitectural canopy underneath, and in so doing create a sense of implied depth. This nuance is not present within the Courtrai chest and can be seen as an indication, potentially, of the hardy slightly later carving date. And I say slightly, but we're talking 70, 80 years, 90 years. It also bears resemblance to the complex microarchitecture of the York Minster chest. I apologize for the quality of these photographs in particular. Dated to the late 14th century, the York Minster serves as a neat chronological foil for both the Oxford and Hardy chests. As a group, these chests give some insight into a very specific type of chest that was being imported from Flanders during and potentially just before the 14th century. Their general composition is more or less uniform from the type of oak used to the way the boards were cut. Even the placement of the lock reserve is fairly uniform, both in its physical location on the frontispiece and the way the designer was uninhibited by its rectangular intrusion into the carved scenes surrounding it. In this specific comparison, the direct incorporation of the lock into the carving's narrative by the Cortride Chest carver is shown in brilliant contrast to other more codified aesthetic standards, and we'll get to the Cortride's lock when we talk about the iconography. It is not unwarranted, then, to infer that characteristics shared by the Hardy and York Minster chest could have been present in the original iteration of the Courtrai chest due to the shearing of its front and back piece. It is very likely that the Courtrai styles could have been carved, and comparisons to these two more or less intact chests suggest that the carvings could have been of figures directly involved within the centerpiece's narrative, such as the squires that flank the jousts they are assisting in within the Hardy chest. To that end, it is not impossible that the images of Guy of Namur and William of Ulick, so prominently featured across the surviving portions of the frontispiece, would have been featured in similarly prominent positions along the styles. Another possibility is that the repeated motif of the goedendag wielding militiaman would have been repeated writ large on the end pieces, though we can never say whether it would have been one or the other or either at all, with certainty due to the unfortunate editorial tastes of time and entropy. Nevertheless, all three chests are operating on a similar aesthetic axis across the breadth and width of the 14th century and provide essential comparative information that informs the way we look at them from the 21st century. Continuing on, before addressing the iconography of the chest, I feel like some historical context is warranted because, first and foremost, the Courtrai chest is concerned with a historical political narrative. The political situation at the turn of the 14th century was quite fraught for Flanders. The Count Guy of Dampierre was imprisoned along with his eldest son and several other notable family members by Philip IV in retaliation for denouncing his liege and making political overtures to Edward I. Edward I, for his part, had wintered an army in Ghent in 1297, although at no point did he move to intercede on Guy's behalf. Quite the opposite. His men engaged in running street battles with the townspeople of Ghent, resulting in what the Annales Gandenses, a chronicle penned by an anonymous Franciscan circa 1308, laments as, and I quote, the shedding of much blood, end quote. By 1302, Philip IV had installed a number of French administrators throughout the county and constructed new fortifications in several of the larger or geographically relevant towns and cities, such as Bruges, Courtrai, and Lille. The Flemish population was effectively split into two camps, the anti-French Clouards and the pro-French Lilliards. And I should mention that Lilliards is a later modern term used to describe the Commodal sympathizers. The patrician elements of the cities, as well as much of the mercantile class, were generally pro-French, while the rural communities and always politically volatile craft guilds, most infamously the weavers, who were never ones to shy from a bit of revolt, were staunchly against the perceived foreign influence. This, in turn, led to even more popular unrest in Flanders, which saw notable leaders such as Pieter de Conick actively resisting French rule, even going so far as to convince the commonalty of Bruges to tear down its new fortifications. Finally, events came to a head in May 1302 when a party of French administrators, along with their entourage and garrison, were attacked in a nocturnal massacre known as the Bruges Matins or the Good Friday. Two separate terms. Good Friday is much more kind of what was used in contemporary accounts. Although sources differ, and French sources in particular differ quite significantly, they do not feel good about any of this. The Annales Gandenses makes it quite clear that the fighting was the result of a miscommunication between the town and Jacques de Chatillon, the French administrator. In response to the widespread Flemish uprising, Count Robert I of Artois led a punitive campaign into Flanders, and this is where it's going to tie into the Courtrai Chest quite soon, I promise you. He was met at Courtrai by a combined force of Flemish militias from Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres, as well as from many other smaller communities and rural assemblies. The Flemish force was led by Guy of Namur and William of Ulick, the first being a younger son of the imprisoned Guy of Dampierre, the latter a grandson. The resulting Battle of the Golden Spurs on July 11, 1302, or Golden Spurs in Dutch, is one of the most famous battles of the late medieval period and was certainly regarded at the time as an infamous or miraculous event, once again, depending who you ask. The Flemish Guilds roundly defeated the French army, which at the time was regarded as the pinnacle of chivalry and martial prowess. The event was immediately mythologized, both in prose, such as Ludwig van Veltem's continuation of the Spiegel Historiale, and in poetry, such as the Passio Francorum Secundum Flamingo, a highly satirical poem that uses biblical pericopes to rebuild the French ad nauseum. This manuscript illumination from a copy of the 15th century French Chronique de Flandre encapsulates many of the mythological elements that had been codified nearly a century after the fact. The presence of nefarious stitches used to trick the French knights, and the Flemish guilds having to do little more than finish off their helpless foe, and a framework that paints the French as noble victims of an ignoble foe and inadequate leadership. And I think this is a useful visual foil to the narrative we're about to unpack on the Courtrai Chest. Speaking of which, returning to the Courtrai Chest, I will now go over its iconographical program. Starting in the upper left corner of the frontispiece, the narrative begins with the arrival of Guy of Namur and William of Ulick, as denoted by their heraldry, a lion rampant with bar for Guy and a flowered lion for William. They are accompanied by an entourage of similarly mounted knights, though specific emphasis has been placed on the two central noblemen as they wear open-faced helmets similar to those of the infantrymen and are led by a goedendag-wielding soldier. The famous Flemish weapon was itself a subject of fierce debate in the 19th and 20th centuries, as many prominent historians had incorrectly envisaged it as a flail-like weapon. This in turn led to several of the early and more dismissive assessments of the frontispiece's authenticity, especially in Belgium, but this is since something that we can corroborate with other visual sources such as the Lugemete Chapel and several images that show up in manuscripts, illuminated manuscripts. Continuing past the lock and a trio of huddled aldermen offering a key towards the approaching Guy and William, and this is what I mentioned with the lock reserve. They're offering the key directly to the lock, which I think constitutes a wonderful little visual pun directed at whoever is kind of viewing the chest. One of the most famous scenes of the chess iconography can be seen unfolding. Verbruggen, the aforementioned venerable historian who published the first, I think, most internally consistent breakdown of the iconographical program, contributed to the codification of the scene as a representation of the infamous Bruges Matins, the aforementioned Matins. One of the prime original outputs of my work, however, has been a re-identification of this scene as not a vignette of a French knight being set upon in his sleepwear while a quote-unquote female saint in a dress looks on, but rather as a site-specific indictment of the punitive French harassment of Flemish communities in general and of their actions in Courtrai specifically. To quote the Annales Gandenses, as the French entered Flemish-speaking Flanders to show their ferocity and terrorize the Flemings, they spared neither women, nor children, nor the sick, but slew all they could find. They even beheaded the images of saints in the churches as though they were alive, or chopped off their limbs. However, such doings did not terrorize the Flemings, but stimulated and provoked them to still greater indignation and rage and violent fighting. End quote. I submit that the visual juxtaposition of the gruesome beheading and the prayerful robed man, garbed identically to those aldermen gathered on the other side of the still open gate, with the hand reaching towards the saint, is the designer of the chest signaling the iconoclastic blasphemy of the French, alongside the physical violence directed at the Flemings themselves. The macabre smiling of the man beheading the robed alderman, staring in the direction of the other citizens who have just fled the town, is met immediately by a stern-faced soldier bearing a shield and upraised sword. Furthermore, the structure housing the saint bears the hallmark iconographic signifiers of a church, with its steepled roof and a reliquary or shrine beneath the carved figurine. The attributes of the saint, pallium and mitre, suggest the presence of a cult of Saint Martin, and St. Martin's Kirk was one of the two prominent churches in Courtrai at the time. Finally, we know that Guy and William were never around Bruges at the same time, and it was around Courtrai that the disparate Flemish forces coalesced before engaging the French. In the interest of time, I will briefly go over the rest of the chest's iconography, starting with the leftmost section of the middle tier of carving. A robed man can be seen blessing a bowed soldier, while the line, a robed monk can be seen blessing a bowed soldier, while the line of Flemish militia gather before battle. They hold flags that bear the emblems of numerous craft guilds. You can see right here Fullers, shipwrights, and wine loaders, and many prominently display the goedendag. On the right side, the motif of impious violence is reiterated, with a trio of soldiers murdering a kneeling, prayerful figure on the far side of an ongoing combat between goedendag-wielding soldiers and a mounted knight. Of note is the repeated left-handedness of the soldier killing the kneeling man, as well as that of the crossbowman. The crossbow itself serves to break the space between the two groups, while the dead militiaman, run through by a lance shaft, reinforces the stakes of the combat. On the lower left side of the chest, the space is dominated by the structure of Cortride Castle, showing the moment during the battle when the Ypres militia repelled a sally by the French garrison. A figure can be seen being raised on the left side of the castle. This is most likely, in my opinion, another visual pun. A jab at the French garrison for abducting Flemish beguines, secular holy women, during the fires that sprang up throughout the town during the fighting. Finally, the lower right section of the chest depicts the Flemish militia in combat during the battle. This section has proven the most useful for military historians, as the famous Flemish formation is displayed in considerable detail. A pikeman repels a charging knight. Guy and William lead from the front, behind a splayed wall of pikes and alongside a row of crossbowmen. Underneath, the grisly aftermath of the battle portrays scenes of looting, corresponding to contemporary accounts that looting and prisoner-taking were strictly prohibited during the fighting. The designer of the Courtride Chest, as I hope to have demonstrated, is chiefly concerned with three things: identity, chronology, and morality. The personages of individuals and groups, the heraldry of Guy of Namur, the gathered banners of the guilds, and their respective actions are given specific attention across the breadth of the frontispiece. The sequencing of events, like any good paratactic medieval narrative, lends itself to a story that is essentially supportive of the Flemish casus belli, going into the Battle of the Golden Spurs. Guy and William arrive to aid a beleaguered populace, which in turn gives them the right and obligation to engage in a divinely sanctioned combat against the French. Finally, the impiousness and sacrilege committed by the French, both against the Flemish population and their churches and shrines, further reinforces the just and righteous intervention of Guy, William, and the guilds in particular, while setting a precedent for the Flemish rebellion against Philip IV in general. So, concerning the chest's provenance, the concrete consensus of the dendrochronological and radiocarbon dating must be given pride of place. This is because, in lieu of any extant documentary evidence, the scientific data is the closest one can get to any degree of exactitude concerning its creation. Returning once again to Fletcher's dating and Tyer's reanalysis, the wood would have been used sometime after 1275, allowing for sapwood and seasoning, with radiocarbon dating corroborating this with a dating window of 1280 to 1420. It is very likely then that the original chest was constructed pre-1302, as it is unlikely the wood would have been aged for nearly 30 years beforehand. But this is one of those things where I look at the camera and say, please someone tell me I'm wrong, or how this exactly works. With the carvings being undertaken upon an already existing chest, or fitted on an older board and then reincorporated. This could account for later structural instability of the frontispiece, as evidenced by the need for extensive repair. And this is one of the kind of recurring things that I've really struggled with in my assessment of the chest that no one really seems to focus on is the traumatic violence that the chest, the frontispiece alone, has sustained over the years is kind of incredible. Entire sections have been cleft and hewn away, and this is outside of any editorial kind of trimming of the sides and the styles. Something happened to this chest. Simply put, the depth and the breadth of the carving severely weakened the chest's integrity, resulting in the need for reconstruction some 300 years later. And if you observe the top of the frontispiece, I don't think I included an adequate picture of this, but there's actually a section of wood supporting parts where the carving actually went too deep. So, other than the dating of the planks, the only other ostensibly solid piece of information we have to work with is the location of its rediscovery. The chest cannot have arrived in Stanton St John before 1305, in keeping with the diplomatic theory and the fact that the manor house there was not used by Sir John until that year. On the far side of that terminus postquem, it was reported by the Harrises that the chest had been in their family as far back as they could remember. The Oxfordshire Wills Index first records a Harris in Stanton St John in 1593. This date gives us 2 points of reference. Firstly, it suggests that the chest was reconstructed in its current form by the Harrises themselves, as its more modern components all suggest an early 16th century refitting. Secondly, it introduces the possibility that the Harrises themselves brought it with them, though this is admittedly unlikely and holds even less water than Van de Vel and Hugobart's gift theory. In summary, we have 4 dates of interest. 1275, earliest construction date, and when I say earliest, I mean really, really early. 1302, earliest carving date. 1593, earliest Harris and Stanton St John. And of course, 1905, its rediscovery by Spooner. All of these dates corroborate the narrative of a late 13th century, early 14th century chest potentially being repurposed as a commemorative object, eventually finding its way from Flanders to England and being upcycled by the Harris family as early as 1590s. However, given the entirely speculative nature of the chest's early provenance, I'd like to put forward a new possible avenue of transmission from Flanders to England that is no more or less likely than those theories already in circulation, but corroborated by historical context and buoyed aloft by strong ongoing work in the field. Given everything that has been taken into consideration regarding the skills, factual knowledge, and material composition of the Courtrai chest thus far, it is most likely, in my opinion, that the chest was constructed in Flanders and imported soon after in a domestic, not diplomatic origin. Not only would this answer circumvent the problems inherent in a diplomatic origin, ones of commission, transportation, and reception, but it is supported conclusively by evidence that must be otherwise stretched to support other competing theories. By the middle of the 14th century, there were several vibrant immigrant Flemish communities in England, the largest and earliest being the one in London that was born out of Edward III's charter in 1326 that sought to supplement the struggling English textile industry with skilled foreign labor. Groundbreaking research by the late Mark Ormrod, alongside Bart Lambert, Jonathan Mackman, and Milan Pajic, have revealed the sheer scale of Flemish immigration throughout the 14th century. Moreover, their research has indicated that many Flemish weavers who made the move across the Channel were radically anti-French and often exiles or outcasts. Indeed, so politically charged was the Flemish enclave in London that it required 2 bailiffs, who were often called in to put down interior disputes between competing factions from different regions of the county. I submit that the radical political narrative carved onto the chest frontispiece, while not sufficient evidence by itself, needs to be accounted for when considering who it could have been constructed for and what fate they and their descendants would have faced in the years after the rebellion was put to bed in 1305. I hope to have demonstrated today that the magnitude of the puzzle presented to us by the Courtrai Chest. Every facet of the object is layered in suggestion and possibility, and even those qualities which are known to us present only more challenging questions. That being said, it is possible to lose sight of the forest for the trees, and the inherent historical, visual, and social value of the chest is only as rich as the questions we ask of it. At the end of the day, exactly how the chest came to reside in Stanton St John, or who in particular commissioned it, are much less interesting and answerable questions than what it is trying to say. I should caveat this with I'm an art historian, I'm very biased. If my contribution to the study of the chest is as simple as insisting that we take its visual program at face value, to trust that its designer, carver, commissioner, and the respective communities they came from had a very specific narrative they wished to capture and display for posterity, then I am content. It is all too easy to demand questions from historical artifacts, when in reality we should be more open to letting them, and the men and women who made them, speak for themselves. Thank you very much for your time and your attention.
No,